First of all, it's a pleasure to be here among you. And I'll be speaking about work that is joint with my long-term colleague, Professor Ali Mbai, who is at Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. And he has a very, very busy schedule. And so I apologize that he couldn't be with us. The other thing that I want to mention is that we have been doing work for a number of years, surveying informal firms. And we've been doing this for some time. And I was at the World Bank at the time, and one of my colleagues there asked for anything that we had to contribute to the discussion of structural transformation. So I would have to say that unlike most of the other papers that I've been able to attend so far, we didn't start out aiming at any particular structural transformation question. It was the people who had the question said, what can you tell us about how the informal economy relates to these things that we're talking about? So this is sort of a collection of work that was, done over in a variety of countries, and just trying to put together what was useful to the issues. I'm having trouble paging down. There we go. Now, one of the advantages of speaking with this group is everybody's very familiar with structural transformation issues. You're all aware that just about all of the cross-country evidence shows that when it comes to scooping up the dividends from structural transformation, that Africa does worse than other developing countries. And so I think mostly our findings are pretty much in line with what other researchers have found, but what we are contributing is just to fill in some of the color and the texture of the details about the informal economy and how that helps to explain observations that have been made. Now, people, of course, have investigated why things are working a little less well in Africa than they have in other places. And there are a number of reasons. One in particular, I think Roderick and Macmillan have pointed out, is that that in contrast with East Asia, where structural transformation led to a lot of export-oriented manufacturers, that part of the world used a lot of they tend to have undervalued currencies, and that Africa, in contrast, did the opposite. They had overvalued nominal exchange rates. But what I'm going to talk about here is more of the kind of overvalued real exchange rate, and in particular, the policies that concentrate rents and that therefore keep domestic costs high. So the main thing to understand, and most of these surveys were done in French West Africa, that these are really rent concentrating and rent seeking types of economies. Lots of the papers I've heard, people talk a lot about the wonders of market transactions, and those don't work they don't work consistently in most of these economies. These are places where a small elite, say the formal elite, has some kind of monopoly control of some rents. They've even been given monopoly rights to import fertilizer or to import rice or to import medicines, or they have some quasi-monopoly access to government contracts. And so these concentrated rents, and they are concentrated by policy, that's the formal economy, but what it amounts to is that prices get high in these areas. In particular, the wages get high. Very French. If you've got extra rents, if you've got extra profits, labor always gets its share. So the formal wage becomes high. And there are a number of other issues. Let me just move along. Most of you know that the migration out of agriculture, and I'd like to emphasize I'm talking about a sectoral migration. It isn't necessarily geographic. They didn't necessarily leave the rural areas, but they're spending less time on agriculture, either in towns or still in the rural areas. Productivity is higher in the urban informal. I don't know than it is in agriculture. That may also be true in rural informal sectors. I just don't have the data. So there's a few cases where we measure urban informal against agriculture. The productivity is higher in urban informal. Large informal firms have higher productivity than small informal firms. And of course, the formal has the highest productivity of all. And basically what we can explain is why people who move out of agriculture in terms of their time or their geography end up in the informal economy. And in particular, they end up in services. This is some data from Senegal, 2011 to 2015. You see the big drop in share of employment is in agriculture, but we don't see any big increase in industry. The big increase is in services. And in particular in informal services. So whatever advantage you may pick up from manufacturing or export manufacturing, they're not getting it here. This is just an illustration of the productivity point that I just made. So as I said before, the real market activity here at the top of the game after the big money is a rent-seeking activity. And what is more wide open in terms of market, in terms of entrepreneurial initiative, of which there is plenty. What's more wide open is the informal economy. That's where people go. So we have high costs in the formal sector. That leaves everybody, if you can't get access to these special rents that I indicated, then you're going to be in the informal sector because you can't afford to function in the formal sector, and that lowers overall national productivity. These is electricity prices. If you could read the small print, you'd see that the highest prices are in Africa. But let me move to this. These are formal wages in a number of countries. The first block is sub-Saharan. If we take GDP per capita as a general indication of the overall labor productivity of the economy, and then look at how actual formal wages compare to GDP per capita, we find that in the exporting powers in East Asia, that the manufacturing formal wage tends to run close to GDP per capita, and that in Africa, especially in West Africa, that the formal manufacturing wage is several times GDP per capita. It's tending to come down, and we do have an exception in Mauritius, which is also a substantial exporter. But the wages, point being, formal wages run high.
Nancy, just to let you know, you have about 4 minutes left for finishing up and any questions.
Oh, okay. Well, then let's run through this quickly. Implications. If you're a domestic entrepreneur, either get connections to the rents or go to the informal sector. If you're a multinational firm, don't come to these countries to manufacture with cheap labor. Formal labor isn't cheap, and that sadly, controlling rent is more lucrative than raising productivity. This leads to a number of policy implications, and I clearly don't have time to read them, but basically, and I'll just leave this slide up, that there's a lot that government can do to avoid this concentration of rent. And there is a lot that they can do to help informal firms rather than trying to crush them. There's a lot they can do to help them, which then would make it more possible for them to formalize. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. I think Hagen has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Nancy, I think this was a very nice presentation and a very important topic. And I think the key message is very clear from your presentation, and a very important key message. But I have 3 questions, if the chair allows me to ask those 3. First question would be, how do you measure informal labor or informal work? Is it small firms? Is it unregistered firms? Because I only saw this source from the Senegal labor force survey, or a survey from the National Statistical Office, because I think it makes a big difference whether you include large informal firms or second question would be, so you cited in the introduction work Macmillan, but my question would be, are you aware of the more recent empirical work from Macmillan with Albert Sufag or with Danny Roderick, where they analyze Ethiopian and Tanzanian firms? Because there they also have this deep analysis of informal firms where they talk about small firms and show that small firms tend to be very unproductive in African countries and don't trade. And third question is more of a comment, actually. Don't you think that the manufacturing wages are that high in African countries because of the high agricultural employment share? Because wages in agriculture tend to be lower in general for a lot of developing countries. And of course, manufacturing appears to be higher if there are a lot of workers in agriculture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. First of all, we have could cite a lot of our early work about the details of our methodology and the survey. We have a number of indicators of formality and informality. And what we do is we just construct an index. How many of these characteristics are true of you? So that's why we have the more informal and the less informal. It's a continuum with a matter of degrees. Going to Macmillan, I appreciate the reference, and I will certainly look into it. What I can say is that we also make an important distinction between large informal firms and small informal firms. And a lot of the literature on informality seems to assume that all informal firms will be small, either because their survey is designed that way, or the Latin American literature tends to focus a lot on hiding. If you're in the informal sector, you will have to hide. But in Africa, in much of Africa, it really just isn't the case. You may hide your income, you may hide your employees, but you don't need to hide the fact that you exist. It is not illegal to be a business and not be registered. So that is something, but they are also often protected as well, just like the formal firms. Not as much, but they often get some kind of